So before we begin, you should know this content is for education and facilitating self-empowerment. However, this platform exists to cultivate an addictive and abusive codependent relationship with a vapid, materialist pop culture, while data scraping algorithms sync your personal metadata onto pattern maps used to anticipate and then invert emergent trends in our collective evolution of consciousness in an effort to compromise our ongoing mass awakening. In this video, I'm going to take a break from my usual esoteric topics and talk about something that has been something I've been observing for a couple decades. Living as a white minority for about a third of my life in a low-income environment that was predominantly people of color, mostly Black and Hispanic, whether that be in a type of ghetto or inner city or in a house of correction. I've observed intimately something that is going on that is devastating to the Black community in particular, and it affects the Hispanic community as well. I guess you could say that much of what I'm going to say here about the fake Black culture that's been foisted upon an unsuspecting group of people that have been deracinated from their older culture is something that also is applicable to other marginalized minority groups, particularly Hispanics. And what I'm seeing going on seems to be counterintuitive and is certainly opposite from the popular paradigms put out by the media, in which the Republicans are racist and the liberals are champions of the oppressed and people of color. I'm sure you can find plenty of racists among the Republicans, and I've never voted Republican in any major elections in my life, and I don't plan to. But that being said, what's going unnoticed overwhelmingly, particularly by the left, is that the most devastating policies and paradigms affecting the Black community are coming from the political left. And Democrats might be unknowingly the biggest part of the problem when it comes to generating a kind of social upward mobility for oppressed people. And I want to talk about that oppression. I want to talk about some of the liberal policies that are destroying Black communities. And I'm talking about it because it doesn't seem like there's a lot of people coming from my centrist political position. I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat. I lean liberal in some ways, conservative in many others, and I'm stuck in the middle with you guys trying to make sense of all this. So we need to talk about why the liberals are not helping Black people, and they just might be, at least the architects of liberal policy just might be the most actively racist and oppressive group of people in America and in Western society. My first example is the liberal policy of affirmative action. The rhetoric sounds nice. Liberals say that they're helping disenfranchised Black kids get to college. Sounds like a good idea. Education's good for everybody. I don't care what color you are. However, what's actually happening is that in these low-income inner cities and urban areas, which are predominantly the homes of Black communities, we have a kind of cherry picking of natural-born Black leaders and exceptional Black students who are then sent to colleges that they're not entirely prepared for. They do well in their underfunded by design schools. So their schools are underfunded, but there's some good students. They get cherry picked. They find natural leaders as well as talented athletes who are leaders, say, in the field or on the court, and they remove these natural-born Black leaders from their communities, and the community is then left with less natural-born Black leaders because affirmative action has cherry-picked them so that they can assimilate them into the middle class, and they very often end up in the suburbs. And the Black community is then left without its leaders. So instead of empowering these people within schools built within their communities, they're taking the leaders out. So what sounds good on paper doesn't always, it doesn't pan out. Now, what's happening very often with people of color in affirmative action is that, let's use the 1600 point SAT model. Say a student is going to graduate high school, they take the SAT. Let's say a black student gets a 1050 or an 1100. Well, they're going to tack on 300 to 400 points onto that SAT score, which also functions like an IQ test. And then those test scores are used in order to place these students within colleges. So a white student gets a 1300 and a black student gets an 1100. The black student gets 300 points. Now they get placed into a school that's a 1400 SAT school, and now they're unprepared. They might do well and say, you know, if we're talking about my home of Western Massachusetts, you got a student that might do well at UMass, but then they go and put him in MIT. Now that student was the head of their class in their school, but they're not going to be at the head of their class at MIT. They're going to be at the bottom. And it doesn't matter to the liberals who enact these policies. All they want to see is black students their freshman year walking around on campus, and they can keep up the appearances. And they can say, look, we're sending black kids to college. The sad fact of the matter is those black students have the highest dropout rates. And come senior year, most of them have already dropped out. And many of them will say it's because the school is racist, not because a racist liberal policy was designed to cherry pick them from their own community and then send them to a school that they didn't test at. They should be at a state university with the 1100 points, going to classes with other white and black students that got the same test scores, instead of rigging the game. If this were a race, you'd be taking the JV squad and putting them up against a Division I team. It's not fair. It's just not fair.
Preferential Policies, an international perspective by Thomas Sowell. Where did you grow up?
I grew up, I guess, in Harlem. I was born in North Carolina.
And your parents moved to Harlem?
Yes.
Where'd you go to school?
And right in the middle of Harlem, PS5.
And college?
I went to Howard University in Washington for a year and a half, and then I transferred to Harvard.
Who most influenced you in your early life to become a student and then now a professor at Stanford?
Oh, good heavens. There'd be so many people. I think my family itself would be the biggest influence. When they came out of the South, their thought was that I would have opportunities which they had never had, and that they wanted me to take advantage of it. And more than that, they realized that there was no way that they, either in terms of money or in terms of education, would be able to do that. And so they looked around for people for me to meet that would help me in some way. And there was a kid named Eddie Mapp that they had picked out for me to meet before I ever got off the train. And Eddie Mapp was from the West Indies, and his mother was much more educated than the members of my family. And Eddie Mapp began to tell me various things, such as that one school was better than another, which would not have occurred to me until it was too late. And that one could transfer so that one could get into a better school. And of course I didn't. He was about a year older than me. And so I was, in effect, able to follow in his footsteps. And I learned about Stuyvesant High School in New York, and took a test and got into there and so on. So I got a very good foundation, largely because of him. He introduced me to my first public library. I remember standing in this room with these tremendous numbers of books and asking, why are we here? Because I don't have any money to buy books. And then he had to tell me what a public library was, and I was about 9 years old. And then once I tried it out, I was like, sounds like a good idea.
When you got to education in the United States, you talked about affirmative action, and you came up with some statistics that I wanted to ask you about. Well, I look for, here it is. You said that at the University of California at Berkeley, for example, where the entering freshman class has been described as, quote, wonderfully diverse, unquote, because the, quote, class closely reflects the actual ethnic distribution of California high school students. These are your words. More than 70% of black students fail to graduate.
Yes.
Why?
Because they're mismatched with Berkeley. That is, these students, the average black student at Berkeley is above the national average on test scores. It's just that the average white student is further above the national average, and the average Asian student further above than the white students. And so in that atmosphere, these students who have every qualification to succeed are artificially turned into failures. And the only beneficiary of that is the University of California at Berkeley. Because what they've effectively done is rented these bodies for window dressing for a few years. And then when they're through with them, they're put aside. A new bunch of bodies are brought in.
Have you told them that?
Oh, yes.
And what do they say to you?
Oh, different things. I remember one fellow saying, "Oh, Tom, I'm just a little guy. I can't do anything about this," which, you know, wonderful. But the people who really have the influence are not the people I've talked with. Those people know exactly what they're doing. There's another group, I guess, that benefits from this. You have an establishment there, a black studies establishment, who needs students to be in their classrooms, and these students serve those purposes. People who have political movements have people they can mobilize for those movements while those students are there. It's very much like what happens in athletics, that you have students who come in, as long as they can score touchdowns, the coach is happy. The fact that these students don't graduate is not the coach's problem. His problem is how to hold on to his six-figure salary and his job. And the students have to be sacrificed, then they are sacrificed.
Let's take it first from the student standpoint. Of 312 black students entering Berkeley in 1987, all were admitted under affirmative action. You say that 70% of those failed to graduate. What would you tell those students to do under the circumstances, knowing that statistic?
I would tell them what I've told students in general of all races to do, which is to go to schools that match your educational capabilities at the time. Because you need to be matched with a school. You shouldn't try to go to where the glitzy name is or what have you. Now, unfortunately, many of the minority students have such low income that they must go to wherever the money is. And the money is disproportionately at the kinds of schools that they will find very, very difficult to graduate from.
So we're eliminating natural black leaders, and then they become disenfranchised and further removed from the life that they could have moved up to. Their upward mobility is hampered. They get this belief that they're getting a shot, and then it doesn't pan out, and now they're left with a coulda, shoulda, woulda, and you can always just blame the man. So we're creating black failures while also taking natural black leaders out of their communities. That's what affirmative action does. If they really wanted to send black kids to school on their own merits, then the liberals would be more interested in increasing the quality of these inner city schools so that the students get a better education and perform at a higher level. So there's talk about an IQ gap amongst the races, but there's science that shows that those IQs are malleable. You can change the IQ of an overall group of people through nutrition and education and discipline. There is a neuroplasticity that allows for this to happen. So a disenfranchised group of people don't have faith in themselves, and then they're given extra points on their test scores so they can go to schools that they're not prepared for. And their communities are left without the most vibrant leaders, and then the kids who don't go to college are left in the community without the more intelligent neighbors. And so this kind of feeds into the culture of the streets and the pop culture, which then raises these children, which predominantly don't have two parents in the home. It's overwhelmingly unprepared young single mothers taking care of these kids who are left without the natural born leaders, and so they look to social influences and social influencers and icons and heroes within pop culture. And it's worth noting that pop culture comes from the film industry and record labels, none of which are owned by black people. And this brings us to the welfare trap, which plays in with affirmative action. On the surface, like affirmative action, it sounds good, right? There's people that are disenfranchised, and we need to come together and provide them with financial aid so that they can get better. But that's not exactly what welfare and food stamps do. The funding is designed in order to perpetuate single-parent households. Single mothers are told they can get more money if they have more kids. And they get more money if there's not a man in the house. In fact, they're more likely to get approved if there's not a man in the house. And this goes the other way for single fathers as well. There's statistically fewer of them, but that's a reality as well. So we have single parents being incentivized, even though they're poor, to have more kids because they'll get more money. And this is a deadly trap. It's what I call stay in your lane funding. Now, I talked about how the natural-born leaders, the charismatic leaders, whether they're athletes or intellectuals, they're removed from the black community. And the people that are left are put on stay in your lane funding. It's not enough to make investments, it's not enough to buy real estate, and it's not enough to get out of the ghetto. It's enough to not die and have more kids. Now, if you're not married or you're single and you can't take care of your kid, why would you have more? This system enables people who are incapable by any other means for taking care of themselves and their kids to have more kids. And this particular population growth rate seems to affect Hispanic communities statistically more than the black communities. The Hispanic community seems to be even more willing than the black community to have larger families in poverty while staying on this social aid. And what happens with these very young parents is that you have a 16-year-old girl having kids, and she's a single mom. She goes on welfare, and 16 years later, she's got a 16-year-old daughter who gets pregnant. Guess what? She's a 32-year-old grandmother. Think about that. This stuff happens. And these kids, very quickly, with the lower age of pregnancy on average, allows these communities to grow at a fast rate, and they're paid for by the state. And the overwhelmed single parents who were raised by kids and ill-prepared and ill-educated parents themselves are less capable of providing for their children, who then end up getting raised by pop culture. And are any of these media outlets that create the pop culture owned and operated by people of color? That's a no. There aren't any of the major... You might say, oh, well, such and such a rapper got a record label, like Nas runs Mass Appeal Records. But if you follow the money, Nas's record label, Mass Appeal, is owned by Sony, and Nas works for Sony. And he doesn't make as much money as he says in his rap music, which is why he's still creating rap albums. He released 2 of them last year. He's got to keep that money coming in, and it's not all his, it's for Sony Music. And black people don't own Sony, they don't own Universal. Shit, they don't even own Motown anymore. So, I mean, black entrepreneurs and entertainers and business owners literally had it better in the 50s. And in the 60s, when we started implementing these policies, we saw more black men leaving their families. We saw more blacks going on, entering into poverty and staying there. And we saw less black-owned businesses. That's interesting. You would think that with all of the extra education and welfare that you would see more black-owned business, but that's not the case. Black families were better off, black men were better educated, black women were better educated, and there were more black-owned businesses and a lower incarceration rate 60 years ago than there is today. So after almost 60 years of these liberal policies, the black community, in many ways, is more worse off. So they might all have internet and flat-screen TVs and new sneakers, but they're incapable of manifesting any upward social mobility in their lives. And it's largely because they've been put on a leash and given stay-in-your-lane funding. And now, after multiple generations on welfare and state aid, they don't know any better. And this happens to white rednecks as well as the black ghettos. So this is something that affects all lower class people. But as we know, the Hispanic and black communities are disproportionately overrepresented amongst those low-income neighborhoods. And the irony is a lot of these black ghettos are in liberal-run cities. enacting liberal policies. So the liberals who see themselves as champions and white saviors for the oppressed minorities are creating and implementing policies which are training them to not succeed, setting up the intellectuals and the athletes for failure, and then leaving the rest of the community to stay in your lane without the opportunity for upward mobility that the very policies are designed to enact. So these policies are doing the exact opposite of what they're promised to do. And that cannot be argued against by liberals. The black community is worse off in these terms of incarceration, in-family stability, black-owned entrepreneurship. They were better off before these policies were implemented. There's no doubt about it. This leads me to the black rednecks and the thug heroes. The ghetto culture that is perpetuated through pop culture influencers that are lifted up as thug heroes and criminal gangster icons within pop culture. Again, a pop culture that is owned and operated not by black people. So you might see plenty of black rappers and actors and personalities in the media perpetuating these stereotypes, but they are very often not the people they portray. And there's an overwhelming amount of privileged, educated, non-thug individuals within just gangster rap itself. So characters like Dr. Dre was a open homosexual and a disco singer before he became a gangster rapper. It looks like Eazy-E was a homosexual actor, not a thug or a coke dealer. Tupac Shakur studied ballet and acting at a privileged, prep school and worked as a backup dancer and an actor before he ever became a so-called thug in real life. So these are the thug messiahs amongst the culture that's foisted upon young black men who have been deracinated from their roots. Most of these young black men can't tell you what was going on in the Harlem Renaissance when black intellectuals and artists and jazz musicians spoke in an educated manner and created highbrow art that is sophisticated and not only uplifted the black community, but uplifted the perception of the black community in the eyes of other groups of people. And a systematic militarization of young black men and the importation of narcotics into areas like Harlem and other black cities was organized and destroyed the Harlem Renaissance. It's well documented that the CIA imported cocaine and taught young black men how to produce chemically free-based cocaine, aka crack cocaine. So the distribution and the cooking up of crack was a CIA operation. That's no longer a conspiracy theory. There's even a Pulitzer Prize handed out for journalism. Anyway, so the conspiracy theories of yesterday have been confirmed to a degree. It seems like there is architects and engineers of these policies which are openly antagonistic to the black community. But I do believe most liberals mean well. They're just ignorant. They don't know what's going on. And this was going on in white communities down in the South. You had the rednecks were under the same kind of low-class perpetuation. And the cracker culture, as it was called down south, didn't emerge down south. It was imported into the United States through Northern Europe. So cracker culture was a part of England and Scotland and was imported and then implemented down in the South. And so you had the ghetto blacks and the white rednecks and the crackers all pretty much acting the same. There was an abundance of alcoholism, a lack of respect for education, and there was a kind of solipsism that led to racism. They feared things they didn't know about. They were not exposed to other cultures and other ways of life, and they fought amongst each other. It was largely born out of ignorance and desperation amongst a people that were largely engineered by policies. So you get all the crazies and stupid together, make sure they have lots of kids, keep their kids from growing up, and you perpetuate this low info, ignorant, arrogant, drug addicted, alcoholic culture. And then Hollywood would later, decades later, a century later, turn it into this glamorous thing. And young black men grew up with fake thugs. Like Ice Cube went to prep school, but in Boys in the Hood, he portrays this gangster, and then he talks about being a revolutionary, anti-American gangster in his rap music early on. And meanwhile, nowadays, he's a multi-millionaire working for Disney. So, you know, he lives out in the suburbs, has a privileged life, just like he did as a child. He never was a thug. He never was a coke dealer. He never shot or killed anybody. And he's an actor. He's playing a role. So why would these white and Jewish-owned media companies hire black actors who are willing to perpetuate negative stereotypes and then sell them to their own people? If we think about this not as white supremacy, but a type of racial supremacy or class supremacy, in which high-class blacks are hired by high-class whites and Jews in order to basically brainwash the lower class section of their own race, you have these race traders within black arts and entertainment that perpetuate these stereotypes. Maybe Tupac didn't know what he was getting himself into as a young man, gay, studying ballet and theater. He just wanted to be a dancer, you know? How many thugs do you know get their start as backup dancers and then become revolutionary thugs later in their mid-20s? That doesn't happen. These people are products of their own environment, and they grow up in that culture. You don't have prep school kids studying ballet and theater and literature deciding to become ghetto thugs in their mid-20s. That doesn't happen. So this is largely the work of either scrupulous young thugs who are talented, that are scouted by Hollywood and record labels, and then, you know, they're willing to perpetuate negative stereotypes and they don't know any better. They're just looking to make some easy money and they think, I'm getting rich, you know, who cares what happens to other people? And they brainwash young kids into thinking that violence and self-hatred and narcotic sales and disrespecting women and having sex with as many women out of wedlock is a good idea. And, you know, if they do it with a cool syncopated beat and they've got a talent for vocalizing something with a creative cadence and they got a good voice, they can make that shit sound good to people who don't know any better. And the white liberals love this music. In fact, statistics show that white people bought more gangster rap than black people. Black people would very often, in the city where I was at, would trade mixtapes at the bus stop, and there was lots of bootlegging and free music going on before the Napster age, but you know, that might be a function of the economic situation, not a cultural difference. But white people stole plenty of music as soon as the internet made it easy as well. So it seemed to be just a function of the environment. But white people made record labels creating gangster rap rich. And then white Italian Americans portrayed fake gangsters in movies that were funded and organized and produced by Ashkenazi Jews who owned the Hollywood production companies. So you had Italians and Jews creating fake stereotypes that were then emulated by young black men that had nothing to do with cracker culture or the ghetto culture before the entertainments and the social influencers convinced them this is what it means to be a black man. And now they're taught that bad grammar and hostility and disrespecting people of their own race and selling their own, you know, neighbors, predominantly people of color, you know, black people selling black people drugs and shooting each other. This is all part of what it means to be black, according to this fake culture that is completely created, again, by corporations that aren't owned by black people and are certainly not operating in their best interests. And the young kids don't know any better because their parents are kids and they don't live together and they're raised in the streets, and those streets are devoid of any natural and intelligent leaders in their communities who are empowered to uplift their communities because affirmative action removed them from the ghettos. So the ghettos stay the ghetto and they get worse, and then the welfare state keeps you on just enough to not die funding, and then you're sold dreams that if you just flip some cocaine money you can get into real estate and become a billionaire like Jay-Z or Russell Simmons. And it's bullshit, and that doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. So these false paradigms and devastating policies that are weapons used against people of color wouldn't be able to succeed for so long. And by succeeding, I mean they succeed when blacks and people of color don't succeed. They succeed by keeping people down. Stay in your lane. And this wouldn't be possible without overwhelming, casual, liberal racism. Now, most liberals will say, yeah, I'm not racist. I want what's best for black people. I want to help them. Couched in many of their beliefs and in their ignorance is this idea that the black people can't help themselves. They need white saviors, right? Think of Bill Gates going down to Africa. Bill Gates, a software tycoon, he's going to go down to Africa and inject all these babies with some medicine, and he's there to save the day because the black people can't do it for themselves. We need people like Bill Gates and Melinda Gates to go down there and save Africa from themselves. That's racist, whether you realize it or not. I want to help them. You're not helping. Many of them don't want your help. Anyway. Or they could use some legitimate help, right? Like, help us implement a system in which we can ratchet ourselves up. Or many of them come from a completely different culture where everybody having computers and new sneakers isn't their top priority. And it's racist for white people to say, oh, they don't have our modern, white, liberal culture, therefore they're worse off. That's viciously racist. Think about it. Right? They're not doing well because, they don't have skyscrapers. It's ridiculous. It's racist. Also, there's this inherent, embedded concept of black fragility. Now, I know white fragility, the book and the concept have been all the rage the last couple of years, probably because white people and white liberals in particular have a sense of white guilt, because intuitively maybe they know that they're part of the problem, but they're not willing to actually speak up on it. So they just label themselves fragile. When, as far as I can tell, there's plenty of conservative-leaning people that are willing to talk about this, but they just get labeled with a rubber stamp as racist. Even black conservatives, from Supreme Court Justice Thomas to maybe one of the most, if not the most important American black intellectual of the past century, Thomas Sowell, liberals can't argue with these guys, so they just rubber stamp them racist. I remember when Trevor, what's-his-face, the guy on Comedy Central doing the news thingy, was mocking Ben Carlson, the brain surgeon who was running for president a number of years ago. Would have been a much better candidate than Donald Trump, that's for sure. Anyway, he was mocked by Trevor. Is it Trevor Noah? Is that his name? Anyway, he's a high yellow British sellout race trader mocking an inner city young black kid who rose to be one of the most prominent brain surgeons in the country. And he was notable, Ben Carlson was notable for performing the first split brain operation on Siamese twins or conjoined twins that shared a cerebellum and had their brains fused, and he performed a successful operation to separate them.
I don't think of myself as a surgeon. Just a guy people pay to stab their brain until they're healthy.
So here we have the most prominent brain surgeon in the country, a leader in his field, a black man from the low income, and Trevor Noah, who's a mixed race, light-skinned British guy, making fun of Ben Carlson because he wasn't black enough. He wasn't ghetto enough. So his authenticity as a black man was questioned because he didn't speak in an ignorant tone, and he didn't pronounce words correctly like a black person should. So liberals have this idea embedded, and this is sold to other low-class black people, that if you're educated and you don't speak like you're ignorant and use bad grammar, then you're a sellout and you're acting white. But there is no acting white. White people act all types of different ways. You can travel across the country and there's no white way to act. They're all over the place. Black people think that there's a white way of being, and it's bad because the whites are the oppressors. So therefore, they're not allowed in their low-class communities to get educated or to speak intelligently, because they've been programmed to believe that black people don't do that. And again, go back to the Harlem Renaissance, read some James Baldwin, listen to Miles Davis and John Coltrane. These were well-dressed, well-articulated, intelligent black men at the forefront of their culture. They were creative geniuses, and black people were proud of them. Nowadays, only white hipsters listen to that music and read those books mostly, because black people see that shit as selling out. Black people don't have time for jazz music. It's overwhelmingly purchased and listened to by white intellectual liberals. It's crazy. The fruits of their labor is now not even enjoyed by the low-class black community overwhelmingly. And if you talk to white liberals about what's wrong with certain policies, we'll use voter rights for an example. There's a guy by the name of Ami Horowitz that produced this viral video talking about racism and voter rights, and you can see the overwhelming disparity between the reality in the black community in Brooklyn and what so-called educated white liberals think of black people. So take a look at this and see the disparity here between what the reality is and what white liberals think of black people. Again, this is the real racism, and it's born out of ignorance. But white liberals can't talk about this stuff because they'd rather protect their fragile egos and not get labeled racist than bring up these issues and actually help the black community. So they'll virtue signal that Black Lives Matter, they'll put a sign on their front lawn, but when it comes to actually knowing the black community and what's going on and how they really need help, they don't care. As long as they don't get labeled racist and they have the right sign on their lawn and they put the right hashtag up on their social media, they don't care. They believe that hashtags and lawn signs help the black community instead of perpetuating ignorance.
Do you have an opinion on voter ID laws?
Yeah, they're usually pretty racist and they're bad. I think voter ID laws are a way to perpetuate racism.
Would you go as far as say those laws are racist?
For sure.
Do you think it suppresses the African American vote?
Definitely.
Tell us how.
Because they're less likely to have state IDs.
Minority voters are less likely to have the kinds of IDs that have been described or required.
These type of people don't live in areas with easy access to DMVs or other places where they can get identification.
You can always get IDs you do over the internet. Does that also make it difficult for black people in particular?
Yeah, you have to have access to the internet. You have to be able to pay an internet service provider for certain fees.
Do you think that's harder for black people to go online?
Well, I feel like they don't have the knowledge of how it works.
A lot of people have smartphones, but you might not have data.
For most of the communities, they don't really know what is out there just because they're not aware or they're not informed.
I also think there's a repression of black voting with how if you're a convicted felon, you're not allowed to vote and everything. And when you look at swing states like Florida, that's a huge population of the African Americans.
Now I'm here in East Harlem to ask black people their thoughts on what you just heard. Do you have ID normally? You carry ID around?
Yes, I have state ID.
Do you carry ID?
Yes, I do.
Do you know any black person who doesn't carry ID?
No. Everyone that I know has an ID. Why would they think we don't have ID?
That's a lie. Why would they say that?
Do you have ID?
Yes.
Because I have my ID and my friends have their ID, so we know what we need to carry around.
Everybody that I know have ID. That's one of the things you need to walk around with New York with, ID.
Do you know any black adult who does not have ID?
No, I don't.
Is it a weird thing to even say that?
Yes, it is.
What is this, some type of trick candy cameras?
I know, right?
That's the only thing I brought with me.
Those are legit IDs. I heard a lot also that black people can't figure out how to get to the DMV.
Really?
What does that say to you?
I know it's that. It's on 25th Street.
Do you know where the DMV is around you?
It's on 125th Street and 3rd Avenue, I believe.
You know how to get there?
Yeah.
Would you have a problem getting there if you had to get there?
No.
I know these sound like silly questions. You know how to get to the DMV?
Of course.
You know where it is?
Yes.
You can get there?
Uh-huh.
No problem.
No problem.
Just checking.
Okay.
And I also heard a lot that black people, especially poor black people, have no access to the internet, can't figure out how to use the internet.
That's just stupidity, honestly. Everybody has access to the internet. Even a little kid can figure out how to work the internet.
I had access to the internet for years.
You know how to use it properly, right?
Exactly. I do it at work. So, of course, I know how to use it. My kids know how to use it. They all have iPads, iPods, whatever.
Your phone has data?
Mm-hmm.
You can actually
unlimited.
Unlimited data.
Mm-hmm.
I use my phone as a hotspot.
What does that say to you for the people who have this perception of black people?
They're pretty much ignorant. That's what my thought process on.
I just think that's ignorant. Ignorant.
Ignorant. That's the word I'm hearing a lot. Ignorant.
Very, very ignorant.
Does it sound racist for somebody to say that?
I think it is a little racist because, you know, you're putting people in a category and you have no idea what you're talking about.
Maybe a little bit of racist in it, but like I said, I think it's more stupidity and ignorance.
Judging somebody, like, what, you judging them because they black, saying that they don't got it?
What people are they talking to? Who are these people talking to?
Do you have a problem that if you go to vote and they say, can we please see your ID to make sure you are who you say you are? Are you
Love
cool?
showing my ID.
You got no problem with that?
Nope.
Would you have a problem if when you go to vote, if they say, can we please just see your ID to make sure you are who you say you are? Do you have an issue with that?
No.
Would you have a problem if there was a rule where you have to show your ID in order to vote?
I don't think so. No.
Would you have an issue if there was a rule saying you got to show your ID before you vote?
Nah.
Are you cool with that?
Yeah.
Again, I didn't get these opinions from watching YouTube videos. I lived as a white minority in a city surrounded by open-air drug sales and massive incarceration rates. And I watched what was happening in these communities from inside the ghetto and from inside the prisons. I got to know dozens, if not hundreds, of black and Hispanic men that were living in that city with me. And I saw what this programming does to them. And I noticed that the ones that had their heads on straight almost always had two parents in the household. They had a father. And that's kind of embedded in a movie like Boys in the Hood, which is 90% poison, 10% antidote. And it's up to you which pill you take. You're going to take the red pill or the blue pill. Now think about that. You got Lawrence Fishburne offering you the red pill right there in Boys in the Hood. You going to listen to your father, or are you going to listen to these dumb thugs working for record labels owned by people with millennia-long history of hostility towards the black community? And the liberals are ignorant of this or afraid to talk about it. And then, despite their obvious ignorance, which we just showed examples of, despite this vicious ignorance that they have, they'll rubber stamp any black intellectual from a centrist or conservative point of view as an Uncle Tom, which is essentially white liberal for the N-word, basically, right? They're hostile towards black intellectuals because they don't want a black man or woman telling them that they're wrong. And that goes back to the internalized racism that they have a hard time admitting. So I think some of their white guilt is probably well earned. I believe there's a vicious amount of racism within the white liberal community. Again, I'm not saying there's loads of racism. I'm not denying that there's plenty of racists in the conservative movement, but a lot of conservative policies are designed in order to enable entrepreneurs to get up by their bootstraps. Now, again, I don't vote Republican because I don't agree with the majority of their financial policies, and I think that they're bad for the environment, even though I don't sign up for mainstream climate change. Corporate capitalism is despoiling the environment, poisoning rivers, poisoning with mountaintop coal removal and deforestation and spewing shit into the air that then toxifies us. So it may not create, Lake Manhattan like Al Gore says, but it is damaging the environment, and it's bad for wildlife. And I love animals as much as I love the black community. We're all in this together, and we've been programmed. If I took the bait as a white person, then I would think that black conservatives are somehow self-loathing, or they're brainwashed, or they're sellouts. But those criticisms can be leveled against the black race traders who put on a thug posturing and get up and sing and dance and act thuggish for young black men. Say, hey, look at me, go sell some cocaine. You're going to be a millionaire one day. So they pump these kids full of ignorant, stupid bullshit, syncopated over a 4/4 beat. And if the beats are good, the voice is good, they've got a faculty with the cadence and the way they deliver this bullshit, the kids will just nod their head, internalize it, and get brainwashed. And the irony is that typically white liberals are the ones that pay the most money for that entertainment. So the white liberals are financially supporting the Sambos and the Uncle Toms that are selling out in the gangster rap and Hollywood thug roles. And they're poisoning the black community. And then when someone like Thomas Sowell makes sense, they don't debate him. They just call him a racist or an Uncle Tom. That's racist hate speech coming from the left, who can't handle criticism, and they're scared to death to look in the mirror.
New York Times writer Nicholas Kristof, I'm quoting you, asserts that there is you're quoting him, overwhelming evidence that centuries of racial subjugation still shape inequity in the 21st century, quote, closing quote, and he mentions, open quote, the lingering effects of slavery, close quote. And now this is Tom Sowell. If we wanted to be serious about evidence, we might compare where blacks stood 100 years after the end of slavery with where they stood after 30 years of the liberal welfare state.
Yes.
Explain that.
Well, in 1960, which would be almost 100 years after the end of slavery, 22% of black kids grew up in homes with only one parent.
Just 22%?
Yes.
4 out of 5 were in homes with both parents?
Yes. 30 years later, after the liberal welfare state, that number had more than tripled. And so I said, well, let us compare, if we can speculate on how much that 22% was due to the legacy of slavery. But we know that tripling was not due to the legacy of slavery. It was due to the legacy of a whole different set of policies. And you can look at it so many other ways. Education. Stuyvesant High School in New York, as you know, you get into only by passing a very tough exam. In 2012, the percentage of black students who had gotten into Stuyvesant High School was less than 1/10 of the percentage of black students who had gotten into Stuyvesant High School 33 years earlier.
I didn't know that.
There's Dunbar High School in Washington, which was an elite black high school for a very long time. In 1993, the number of kids out of Dunbar High School who went on to college was less than it was 60 years earlier, which would have been in the depth of the Great Depression. And so you can run through a whole bunch of other things like that. Look at the housing projects. The housing projects in the first half of the 20th century, during that first 100 years after slavery, did not have the high crime rates, the murder rates, the graffiti, all the rest of it. We saw none of that was there. People like the New York Times, Kristof should read his own old papers, pointed out that on Saturday mornings it was common in the housing project of this earlier era for parents to leave their doors unlocked because some of the parents could afford television, some couldn't. So the ones who had television would leave their doors unlocked, and the kids from the other families could come down there and watch television with them. Well, now the latest figures show that most people below the poverty line have 2 television sets and cable, but they wouldn't dare leave their doors unlocked. in a public housing project. like, I mean, the average of black kid today, I think, is probably better off, certainly materially, than, say, Ben Carson was when he was growing up.
Ben Carson, the famous
Black
surgeon
neurosurgeon.
at Johns Hopkins.
Right, right.
Who is immensely accomplished in every way.
Yes.
Right.
I would say that certainly the black kids who are growing up today have a higher material standard of living than I had. The difference was that the schools were good when I came along. They were especially good in New York at that time, hard as that is to believe. But the kids who grew up in that same place where I lived, they will not get that same education. Now that can be blamed on somebody, but it has very little to do with what happened 100 or 200 years ago. And it's true in other countries. I mean, in Nigeria, for example, there's a tribe, the Igbos, who are living in one of the least fertile parts of Nigeria, who were in fact enslaved in centuries past by other tribes and so on. When the British moved in and set up schools, the Igbos went for the schools. By the time Nigeria became independent, the Igbos had climbed above the other groups that had been ahead of them to begin with. But there are all kinds of cross currents of factors, the particular culture, or the particular geography. You run through the whole list of them.
You cite in Intellectuals and Race, you cite an observation by the intelligence expert, IQ scientist James Flynn, that just stopped me cold. After the Second World War, you've got large numbers of American troops remaining in Germany. For that matter, there's still several tens of thousands there today. And both black and white American soldiers had children with German women. And Flynn discovered that those children growing up in Germany showed no IQ differences at all. The black kids and the white kids, the same. Quoting Intellectuals and Race, Professor Flynn concluded that the reason was that the offspring of black soldiers in Germany, and now you're quoting Professor Flynn, grew up in a nation with no black subculture, close quote. Which means what? Which means they experienced exactly the same expectations? Is this
No, the expectations are external. The culture in which they grew up was not the culture in which black kids grew up in America today.
So they had...
There's no gangster rap that was pervasively available in Germany.
So here's what I'm getting. There is something about black subculture in America today that holds African Americans themselves back?
Yes. In fact, I went into this in a previous book on which about black rednecks and white liberals, because that same subculture.
Let's talk about two of your books here. Go ahead.
Because that very same subculture held whites in the South back as well. That in the time this mental testing in the First World War turned up, among other things, the fact that whites from various 4 or 5 southern states scored lower on the mental test than blacks from 4 or 5 northern states. And so it really was a question of the subculture that was there, which was a handicap to both.
All right. And so whose job is it to say, wrong subculture, folks, you're harming yourselves?
Well, I would think in an ideal world that intellectuals might take on that task, but the world that we live in, I've noticed, is not ideal.
All right. What is to be done? Take a look at President Lyndon Johnson speaking at Howard University in 1965.
Oh, yes.
But freedom is not enough. You do not wipe away the scars of centuries by saying now, you are free to go where you want and do as you desire and choose the leaders you please. You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bringing up to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others, and still justly believe that you have been completely fair.
It's pathetic. It's not a question of There's no you who has the control to be completely fair or completely unfair. I mean, the circumstances are. So someone once criticized mental tests on grounds that the tests were unfair, and I think it was David Reisman who said the tests are not unfair. Life is unfair, and the tests are measuring the results. But who has control of life? Who has control of the past? Who has control of the culture that people have in the present, which they've inherited from the past?
So Lyndon Johnson, he's in fact, although good liberal that he was, at least in regard, Lyndon Johnson had a complicated career and changed positions on issues many times, but good liberal though he was at that moment, he was in fact engaging in a breathtaking arrogance.
Yes.
On two counts. One, that white people were the ones who were responsible for where black people stood in the race, that it was up to whites entirely. That blacks, as he described, I'm
devastating.
Black people are passive, they're acted upon.
That's right, that's right.
And then the second act of arrogance is the supposition that somehow the federal government could fix it.
Yes, it is staggering. But if you wanted to be charitable, you could say, well, he said this in 1965. But if you say, all right, why are people now repeating it in 2013 when we've had nearly half a century of experience to the contrary? And if you look within the black community, those blacks who had escaped what I call the black redneck culture, they've moved on. So, but it's the culture the different parts of the black community had. They were different.
Daniel Patrick Moynihan, in his famous 1965 report entitled "The Negro Family: The Case for National Action," close quote. Longish quotation, but it gets to something, I believe. Moynihan, the fundamental problem is that of family structure. The Negro family in the urban ghettos is crumbling. A middle class has managed to save itself, but for vast numbers of the unskilled and poorly educated, the fabric of conventional social relationships has all but disintegrated. So long as this situation persists, the cycle of poverty and disadvantage will continue to repeat itself, close quote. When Moynihan wrote those words, the illegitimacy rate among African Americans was 25%. Today, the illegitimacy rate among white Americans is 36%. Among Hispanics, more than 50%, and among African Americans, more than 70%.
Yes.
Aside from throwing up your hands in despair, what is to be done?
The first thing to be done is to understand that this was a result of policies begun in the 1960s. This is not a legacy of what happened 100 years before the 1960s.
The breakdown of the black family is not a legacy of slavery.
No. If you, the classic study of this goes all the way back to the era of slavery, and they find that most black kids, even under slavery, had lived with two parents. And that was true all the way up until the 1960s. And so if you really want to find out what's changed, it has changed since the 1960s. And the fact that whites now have a higher rate of illegitimacy than blacks had when Moynihan wrote suggests that this is something that spreads out. But if you look at something else, if you look at those blacks, look at black husband-wife families, the poverty rate among such families has been in single digits every year since 1994. And so if you look at the external causes, why the husband and wife families and the welfare single mom families all are facing the same society and objective things, but the results are radically different because the cultures and values are different.
So you would roll back welfare. I guess that's the principal policy. So what would Tom Sowell do? One, you'd eliminate welfare, you'd reform welfare. What would you do?
Roll it back.
All right. And what about affirmative action?
Eliminate it.
Just gone.
Yeah.
Colorblind policy completely. All right. What prospect for that do you see?
None.
No black leader of any standing. I'm talking about a political leader as opposed to an intellectual such as yourself. You've got, well, there's you, there's Walter Williams. Do you get the sense that there's a growing generation, a rising generation of African American intellectuals who say, enough of this, I'm with Tom Sowell?
Well, I don't know if they'll go that far. There's no point.
That would be asking a lot.
There's no point being reckless. But I think there are people like Shelby Steele and many others, Larry Elder. You can run through a long list, and there are more such people now than there were, say, in the 1970s. But in terms of political leaders, all the incentives politically are for black leaders to blame all problems in the black community on the larger society. And that enables them to take on the role of being the defender of the black community against enemies, which in turn creates the situation in which many blacks don't feel that anything that they do is going to help themselves unless it's done politically as a group. That there's no point. I mean, why would you, if you believe what they say, why would you want to knock yourself out in the school knowing that the man is not going to let you get anywhere? One of the most pathetic things I heard in recent years was a young black man saying that, at one point he thought he would join the Air Force and become a pilot. And then he says he realized that the white man is not going to let a black man become a pilot. And he was saying this decades after the Tennessee Airmen had established their reputation in combat in Europe. But the hopelessness is one of the big products of the race industry. That you have no chance. I remember giving a talk at Marquette, and at the end of the talk, among the questions that was asked, a young black man got up and he said, "Even though I am graduating from Marquette University, what hope is there for me?" And having gone through college when I was in the 50s, I don't remember any blacks saying that in the 1950s, when there was a lot more obstacles to overcome than there were when this guy is graduating from Marquette. But you have to produce that kind of feeling in order to serve the interests of those in the race industry.
These people are creating a terrible problem in our cities. They can't or won't hold a job, they flout the law constantly and neglect their children, they drink too much, and their moral standards would shame an alley cat. For some reason or other, they absolutely refuse to accommodate themselves to any kind of decent, civilized life. Race and rhetoric have gone together for so long that it is easy to forget that facts also matter. And these facts often contradict many widely held beliefs. Fantasies and fallacies about racial and ethnic issues have had a particularly painful and deadly history, so exposing some of them is more than an academic exercise. The history of intergroup strife has been written in blood in many countries around the world and across centuries of human history. The purpose of this book is to expose some of the more blatant misconceptions poisoning race relations in our time. The reasons for these misconceptions range from simple, innocent ignorance to reasons that are far from simple and far from innocent. Many of the facts cited here may be surprising or even startling to some readers, but they are not literally unknown to scholars. They have simply not been widely discussed in the media or even in academia. Too much has been assumed for too long, and too little has been scrutinized. It may be optimistic merely to suggest that racial or ethnic issues can be discussed rationally. Evidence to the contrary is all too abundant in the strident and sweeping condemnations directed against many who have tried to do so. Yet there is also evidence in recent years of a growing willingness to consider views that differ from the racial orthodoxy that has prevailed largely unchallenged from the 1960s onward in intellectual circles and in the popular media. In any event, these essays summarize the conclusions of more than a quarter of a century of my research on racial and cultural issues, as well as drawing on the work of innumerable other scholars around the world. These writings do not pretend to be definitive. If they provoke thoughts on a subject where cliches and dogmas too often prevail, then this book will have achieved one of its major goals. However, even a work seeking primarily to untangle a complex set of historic social issues can provoke the fashionable question, but what is your solution? Yet, there is not the slightest danger that there will be a shortage of solutions. On the contrary, an abundance of uninformed solutions has been one of our biggest social problems. Any serious consideration of social problems is likely to involve trade-offs rather than neat solutions. And trade-offs depend on values which can vary from one individual to the next. What trade-offs others might make after considering what these essays have to offer is not something that can be predicted, nor is such a prediction necessary. There is still much to be said for the ancient adage, with all you're getting, get understanding. If this book can contribute to understanding on a subject where misunderstandings abound, then it will have done its work. Because this book is written for the general public, it does not feature long, convoluted sentences with escape clauses designed to prevent words from being twisted to mean something that they were never intended to mean. Common sense can be more readily expected when writing for the general public than when writing for the intelligentsia. To prevent the words in the essays that follow from being stretched, twisted, or given clever meanings, let me state here and now that these essays do not mean that 1. All Southern whites were or are rednecks. That 2. All black Americans today or in the past were or are black rednecks. That 3. Jews are exactly the same as the other groups with whom they are compared. Or that 4. Slavery is somehow morally acceptable because everyone was guilty of it. One cannot predict, much less forestall, all the clever misinterpretations that others might put on one's words. The most that can be done is to alert honest people to the problem. While this book is not particularly large in bulk, its scope is worldwide, and it goes back through centuries. No one can write a book of such scope without incurring many debts to others. These include scholars who devoted much of their careers to the study of some particular specialty, such as the history of agriculture in the southern United States or the origins in Britain of various social groups in America. Such debts are too numerous to list here, quite aside from the danger of implicating other writers in conclusions which are my own. What must be acknowledged is my debt to the Hoover Institution, which has provided the conditions and the support which have facilitated my research and writing for more than 2 decades. For much of that time, my research assistant, Na Leo, has been an indispensable part of my work, and for this particular book, she has been very ably assisted by the dedicated work of Elizabeth Costa. In the end, however, I must and will take full responsibility for the conclusions reached in the essays that follow. Thomas Sowell, Hoover Institution, Stanford University. Black rednecks and white liberals. These people are creating a terrible problem in our cities. They can't or won't hold a job, they flout the law constantly and neglect their children, they drink too much, and their moral standards would shame an alley cat. For some reason or other, they absolutely refuse to accommodate themselves to any kind of decent, civilized life. This was said in 1956 in Indianapolis, not about blacks or other minorities, but about poor whites from the South. Nor was Indianapolis unique in this respect. A 1951 survey in Detroit found that white Southerners living there were considered undesirable by 21% of those surveyed, compared to 13% who ranked blacks the same way. In the late 1940s, a Chicago employer said frankly, "I told the guard at the plant gate to tell the hillbillies that there were no openings." When poor whites from the South moved into northern cities to work in war plants during the Second World War, occasionally a white Southerner would find that a flat or a furnished room had just been rented when the landlord heard his Southern accent. More is involved here than a mere parallel between blacks and Southern whites. What is involved is a common subculture that goes back for centuries, which has encompassed everything from ways of talking to attitudes toward education, violence, and sex, and which originated not in the South, but in those parts of the British Isles from which white Southerners came. That culture long ago died out where it originated in Britain, while surviving in the American South. Then it largely died out among both white and black Southerners, while still surviving today in the poorest and worst of the urban black ghettos. It is not uncommon for a culture to survive longer where it is transplanted and to retain characteristics lost in its place of origin. The French spoken in Quebec and the Spanish spoken in Mexico contain words and phrases that have long since become archaic in France and Spain. Regional German dialects persisted among Germans living in the United States after those dialects had begun to die out in Germany itself. A scholar specializing in the history of the South has likewise noted among white Southerners archaic word forms, while another scholar has pointed out the continued use in that region of terms that were familiar at the time of the first Queen Elizabeth. The card game whist is today played almost exclusively by blacks, especially low-income blacks, though in the 18th century it was played by the British upper classes and has since then evolved into bridge. The history of the evolution of this game is indicative of a much broader pattern of cultural evolution in much more weighty things. Southern whites not only spoke the English language in very different ways from whites in other regions. Their churches, their roads, their homes, their music, their education, their food, and their sex lives were all sharply different from those of other whites. The history of this redneck or cracker culture is more than a curiosity. It has contemporary significance because of its influence on the economic and social evolution of vast numbers of people, millions of blacks and whites, and its continuing influence on the lives and deaths of a residual population in America's black ghettos, which has still not completely escaped from that culture. From early in American history, foreign visitors and domestic travelers alike were struck by cultural contrasts between the white population of the South and that of the rest of the country in general, and of New England in particular. In the early 19th century, Alexis de Tocqueville contrasted white Southerners with white Northerners in his classic Democracy in America, and Frederick Law Olmsted did the same later in his books about his travels through the antebellum South, notably Cotton Kingdom. De Tocqueville set a pattern when he concluded that almost all the differences which may be noticed between the Americans in the southern and in the northern states have originated in slavery. Olmsted likewise attributed the differences between white Southerners and white Northerners to the existence of slavery in the South. So did widely read antebellum Southern writer Hinton Helper, who declared that slavery, and nothing but slavery, has retarded the progress and prosperity of our portion of the Union. Just as they explained regional differences between whites by slavery, so many others in a later era would explain differences between blacks and whites nationwide by slavery. Plausible as these explanations may seem in both cases, they will not stand up under a closer scrutiny of history. It is perhaps understandable that the great overwhelming moral curse of slavery has presented a tempting causal explanation of the peculiar subculture of Southern whites, as well as that of blacks. Yet this same subculture had existed among Southern whites and their ancestors in those parts of the British Isles from which they came, long before they had ever seen a black slave. The nature of this subculture, among people who were called rednecks and crackers in Britain before they ever saw America, needs to be explored before turning to the question of its current status among ghetto blacks and how developments in the larger society have affected its evolution.
Whenever we have these flare-ups, whether it's a Ferguson or a Trayvon Martin, my concern is that we start having discussions, but they're the wrong discussions. They're discussions really on what I would consider side issues that don't really get at the underlying problem. So we start talking about gun control or racial profiling or tensions between the black community and the police or unemployment and poverty in these communities. But I think what is underlying episodes like that is black criminality in America. It is the black crime rate. Blacks are about 13% of the population. They commit about half of all murders in this country. Blacks are arrested at 2 to 3 times their numbers in the population for all manner of violent crime, all manner of property crime. Until we solve that problem, until we get at that racial disparity in crime rates, there's going to be tension between the black community and police. There's going to be racial profiling. Young black men are going to be perceived a certain way so long as those crime statistics are what they are today. If you want to get at those perceptions, if you want to get at that tension in the black community, you need to get at the behavior that is driving those perceptions. And that is not the conversation we tend to have when these things happen. We start talking about everyone. Do cops value black lives? Does America value black lives? Well, given that half of the murders are committed by blacks and 90% of their victims are other blacks, shouldn't we first be asking if the black thugs in these communities value black lives? Am I supposed to hold whites to a higher standard than I hold blacks when it comes to valuing black lives? So I want to have the right conversation. I want to talk about black criminality, personal responsibility, and I don't want to fob it off on, oh, it's racism, it's a racist criminal justice system. The black incarceration rate in 1960 was lower than it is today. Was there less racism in 1960? The black crime rate in the 1940s and 50s was lower than it is today. Was there less racism back then? These are dodges.